Well, we continue our journey series this morning, and out of the gate, I knew that this particular sermon was coming as I was planning out the series back in the spring. To be honest with you, I wrestled with it a little bit, wrestled with whether or not I should even do this particular message just because of the nature of the message. And so I want to be honest with you this morning as we head out of the gate. Today's message is going to be a little bit of an intense one. And I know normally I'm an intense type of individual up here because I'm very passionate about what I believe. But just the topic of today's sermon and the text that we're going to be studying leads us down a road and down a journey that is not necessarily a comfortable one to go down. Remember last week was not a super comfortable one itself. David found himself as the king of Israel, being blessed by God, seeing a lot of victory, a lot of blessing, but in the midst of that, he falls into sexual temptation and commits adultery with another man's wife. The woman ends up becoming pregnant, and so in order to deal with that, he ultimately has the woman's husband murdered and killed. So David walked down that journey from failure to forgiveness. The next chapter that we're going to hit is a difficult one to go through because this is the journey through sexual abuse. And so what we find is that there are certain topics in Scripture that are uncomfortable to talk about. And as a result, the church has the temptation to remain silent on these issues. The Bible, however, is not silent. Rather, the Bible will address and tackle the issues that our world and our culture are wrestling with. And make no mistake, sexual abuse, as we're going to find out during the sermon today, is a major issue that our culture and that the church is wrestling with. Therefore, we as the church cannot remain silent on some of these issues. But rather, we need to speak out. We need to be a voice. We need to be a place of hope and healing for those who struggle with sexual abuse. So go with me to 2 Samuel 13 this morning. Our series brings us to one of the most actually intense and graphic stories of sexual abuse in all of the Bible. That's found in 2 Samuel 13. So on the heels of David finding an incredible amount of hope in the gospel, the hope that his sins can be forgiven, that his sins can be removed. Okay, so the adultery, the lies, the murder that David had found himself entangled in. David at the end of chapter 12 finds himself just struggling and then finds hope in the gospel and finds hope in forgiveness. But as we know, there are always consequences to our sins, aren't there? And one thing I want to be clear about this morning, especially as we head into this topic, is that even though there is forgiveness, and even though there is hope, and even though there is restoration, there are always consequences to our sin, aren't there? That's the nature of sin. It always brings consequences that we have to deal with and grapple with. And the family of David is beginning in chapter 13 to bear the consequences of David's sin. So let's begin reading the scriptures. 2 Samuel 13, verse 1. Read along with me. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, loved her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a crafty man, meaning he was a dirtbag. That's my interpretation from the Hebrew. And he said to him, O son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me? And Amnon said to him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. And Jonadab said to him, lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat and prepare the food in my sight that I may see it and eat it from her hand. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to him, Amnon said to the king, please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight that I may eat from her hand. So let me explain real quickly what's happening in the story. David has two sons from different women. We know that David had a number of different wives. And he had a son named Amnon, and he had a son named Absalom. And Absalom and Tamar were both brother and sister siblings from the same woman. And then he had Amnon, who was the son from another woman and another wife. And so Amnon developed a love and what went beyond just an affection. It went to lust for his half-sister Tamar. To the point where he was so desirous of her that the Bible says he became ill and sick and so tormented that he couldn't have her. So his buddy, Jonadab, was like, hey, got a plan. Pretend to be ill and ask your dad, David, the king, to bring in Tamar to serve you and to minister to you. And so he does that. He pretends to be ill. He lies. He sets this all up. So the stage is set. The stage is set. And so verse 7, David sent to Tamar, saying, go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house where he was lying down, and she took dough and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and baked the cakes, and she took the pan and emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, send out everyone from me. So everyone went out from him. So he clears the room, and it's just Amnon and Tamar together in the room. And Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the chamber that I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them to the chamber to Amnon, her brother. But when she brought them near to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? Or as another translation would say, where could I rid me of my disgrace? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not hold me from you. But Amnon would not listen to her. And being stronger than she, he raped her. So what we have in the scriptures is a very detailed account of a sexual abuse and a sexual assault that takes place. Amnon being in the position where he could no longer deny his lust and that which he was being tormented with, sets up this plan. Tamar comes in. He sends everyone out of the room. She comes into the chamber with him, and there he forces himself upon her. She refuses. She tries to fight back. She tries to tell him, this is outrageous. This will only bring shame and disgrace upon you and upon me. And so she begs him in that moment. She begs him not to do it. But being stronger, he forces himself upon her and he rapes her. And so as we look at what happens in the scriptures with sexual assault and sexual abuse, I want us to talk about how it affects us in our culture and how it affects the church and how we as a church can help those who have been victims of sexual abuse or sexual assault. But I think in order to do that, we have to start with what it is. Because I think there's even a lot of confusion out there as to what it actually is. Because some of you, even in this room this morning, maybe even struggle with something that had happened to you that maybe you're confused. Was that a sexual assault? Was that consensual? What was going on here? And so the sexual assault has been something that has bred a lot of confusion and frustration within individuals. And we can look at the account here in 2 Samuel and say, well, that was clearly a sexual assault, but sometimes those lines aren't so clear. And so let me give you what I found to be the best definition of sexual abuse or sexual assault as we discuss, first of all, the nature of sexual abuse from 2 Samuel. First of all, taken from Justin Holcomb, who really wrote what is, in my opinion, the best book out there on dealing with sexual abuse. And so if this is a topic that has hit you or your family or something that you've struggled with, I would highly recommend Rid of My Disgrace, written by Justin Holcomb. You can download that. You can order it on Amazon. But he puts it this way. It says sexual abuse is defined as any type of sexual behavior. So not just sexual intercourse, but any type of sexual behavior. or contact. All right, so the first aspect of it, there is some sort of sexual behavior or sexual contact. The second aspect of sexual abuse is that it is where consent is not freely given or obtained. So there's not like open, free consent given to the sexual abuse or the behavior or the contact. And the third aspect is this is accomplished, through force, which is really what we see in 2 Samuel here. That the sexual abuse happens through a force. But what we don't often understand sexual abuse to be, and this is where I think this definition helps to clarify things, that sexual abuse is not just through force, although that's one way. It's through intimidation, through violence, through coercion or threats, manipulation, which is big. You can manipulate someone to the point where there is a sexual act that takes place, but it's not necessarily through consent, it's through manipulation. And that's every bit as a part of sexual abuse as force, deception, or abuse of authority. And so I think it's clear, it needs to be clear to the church, and we need to understand clearly what is this that we're dealing with. Because the reality is this, as much as we would like to not deal with it, as much as we would like to kind of shelter ourselves from sexual abuse, the reality is this, sexual abuse is real and it happens. And the reality is this, you sitting here today, every one of you, know someone who's been sexually abused, whether you know it or not. You see, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men have been or will be sexually abused in their lifetimes. So, I mean, we could do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, sexually abused. 1, 2, 3, 4, sexually abused. 1, 2, 3, 4, sexually abused. It's in this room. It's in our families. And it's not something that's easy to talk about. It's something that's hard and difficult to talk about. But we cannot be silent on it, church, because it's a reality that we all are impacted by. 1 in 6 women, this statistic actually shocked me. 1 in 6 women have been raped at some level. It's 1 in 6. Think about this. Think about the thousands and thousands and thousands of women out there that carry that shame with them every day. We need to understand that sexual assault can occur in marriages, not just amongst strangers. It's not just the woman who gets assaulted in the park at night in Philadelphia. It happens in marriages. So if you go back to our definition of sexual assault, it's a reality that sexual assault can happen in marriages, between partners, friends. In fact, sexual assault occurs in 10 to 14% of all marriages. So we keep silent on it, because the idea of sexual assault brings a lot of shame. We're going to talk about that as we go on. As we look at Amnon, who is in this text the perpetrator, what was his outlook? His outlook was what? Controlled by what? Care, love, and concern for Tamar? No. Lust, control, force, intimidation, right? Offenders are predominantly male and are acquaintances with the victim. As we can see in this text right here, it was a half-brother, half-sister relationship. Of female victims, 73% were abused by someone they knew. So by far, the sexual assaults happened with someone that they knew, as was in the case of our text here. And so when someone would sexually abuse another, they begin to not look upon them with love and respect and care, but rather, as we're even going to see, as you look in verse 15, it says, Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he loved her. Notice Amnon's response to her after the abuse takes place. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go, get out of my sight." Amnon treating her not as a human being, not treating her as an individual created in the image of God with love and respect and care, but rather treating her as something to use and discard and throw away. And so then we're going to have to wrestle then Not with just the nature of sexual abuse, because that's seen. So that's what it is. And I think it's important that we understand clearly what it is. But we also need to understand, and the scriptures are going to be very graphic in dealing with what are the effects of sexual abuse. Like when someone is violated, when their body is violated, when their emotions are violated, when something like this happens, it produces a deep, deep struggle in the individual's life. And if you've never been a victim of sexual abuse, it's hard to identify with that, which is why I'm so grateful that the scriptures just give us a window into the soul of someone who's been abused. That's why this is such a valuable passage of Scripture, because as we're going to read, we're going to see the window into Tamar's heart. We're going to see that as Amnon discards her and sends her away with a hatred, what we're going to see then is what is left in the wake of sexual abuse. And those effects are devastating to an individual. Verse 16 says, "But she said to him, 'No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me.' But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, 'Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her.'" At this point, Amnon is looking like quite a monster, isn't he? I mean, just anger. Get her out of my sight. Has her removed. Has her thrown out. Now look at verse 18. It says, "She was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed." She had a robe that represented her purity, that represented her royalty. So his servant put her out and bolted the door. So what does Tamar do? Tamar puts ashes on her head. She puts ashes on her head. We see that this represents, particularly in this culture, a severe mourning, but also in this case, a total loss of her dignity. You see, sexual abuse does bring about shame, disgrace, and reproach. And as she is thrown out, as she is violated, after the rape, she is sent away. And she takes ashes from the fire and she places them upon her head. This once beautiful, pure daughter of the king is now walking around with ashes on her head. No dignity left. I mean, none of you came in this morning throwing ashes on your head, right? You came in, you did your hair, you wanted to look nice, you looked in the mirror. Why? Because you have dignity. You want to look presentable, you're in church, whatever. At this point, Tamar had no dignity. Walking around, the daughter of the king, ashes on her head. So sexual abuse, it takes a person's dignity and it strips them of their dignity. We see next that Tamar tears her robe. So that robe that represented her purity, that robe that represented her royalty, she takes that robe and she tears it as a representation showing the sorrow and the loss of what was so precious to her. The virgin daughter of the king, not yet married, never been with a man, had lived a pure life, takes that symbol of that purity and she rips it and then puts on what? She puts on the sackcloth as a way to express her deep sorrow and her loss. So she's lost her dignity. She walks in deep, deep sorrow. She tears that robe. She puts on the sackcloth. And then we continue in verse 19. And she laid her hands on her head and went away crying aloud as she went. So we see this motion in the scriptures, a very detailed description of what she does. She places her hands on her head. This reflects feelings of shame and anguish. You ever been there? You ever just, what has happened? That shame, that anguish. And particularly in this culture, as she went away crying and weeping, yes, there was a genuine emotional response to what had happened to her, but there was also a cultural expression outwardly that someone was in mourning. If someone was mourning the loss of something, they would do it very, very outwardly so that it would be seen by all. And as Tamar is sackcloth, ashes, hands on her head, walking around weeping, this is the indication of someone who has lost something so incredibly important to them. They've lost their dignity. It's produced sorrow. It's produced grief. They are in pain and they're in distress. And there is this loud weeping. And the interesting thing is this. We as a church have the tendency to do this because their pain is real. And it's easy to stay silent rather than come to the Tamars who are weeping and in pain and help them find hope. You see, often the response of friends and family adds to the shame. If you read in verse 20, her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you?" Now notice what he says to her. "Now hold your peace, my sister." Translation, be quiet about it. Now Absalom was angry and upset. There was real anger there. But rather than walking her through the shame and disgrace, what does he tell her to do? Let's just not talk about it. Yeah, we're all angry. Yeah, we're mad. But it's too difficult. It's too painful to talk about, so let's keep silent. One of the most devastating things a family member can do when someone's gone through sexual abuse is to keep it silent, to keep it inside, to harbor it. It's exactly what Absalom does here. He says, keep your silence, my sister. Don't talk about it. Keep your silence. I'll bring you into my home. There you can live. So he cares for her, but he doesn't allow her to work through the pain. He doesn't allow her to communicate the pain. He doesn't allow her to take the steps to recovery. And so Absalom, her brother, silences her in verse 20. Verse 21, when King David, her father, heard of all these things, he was very angry. Great, David, you got mad. That's the only, listen, we're studying the reign of David. That's the only response David has to all of this. He gets mad. And I get it. When stuff like this happens, it produces anger. We get mad, don't we? But David gets angry but does nothing. At the very least, comfort her. Communicate with her. Be a father to her. He gets angry. And the text says, that's it. He doesn't go after Amnon. He doesn't deal with the situation. In fact, what he does is he continues to let Amnon be Amnon. There's no indication that David does anything to Amnon. He does nothing to him. Imagine how that made Tamar feel, right? The man who had just raped her, the king is mad, but doesn't do anything about it. It's easy to get mad and do nothing, isn't it? It takes real courage to be angry and in righteous anger do something about it. To protect our daughters, to protect our wives, to protect those who would be preyed upon. And men, we have a responsibility to protect our daughters. Be careful, fathers. Be careful with your daughters. Be careful with them, who they would be with. Be careful with what you allow them to wear. Be careful with your daughters. Love them, cherish them. Be a better father to your daughters than David was to his. The temptation, though, is that families want to deny or minimize the abuse as to avoid shame and embarrassment. This is dangerous. I think to some degree that's what was happening with David's family here. Anger but no action. Anger but no action. We feel justified in our anger but no action. No dealing with the real issues. Oftentimes you'll hear people say things like, don't air out the family's dirty laundry. Forget the past and move on. That was a long time ago. Forget it and move on. You tell someone who's been abused to forget it. It's not that easy. Or, are you sure that probably never really happened to you? So we avoid it. The sexual abuse brings about self-blame. We'll work through this. This is a belief that my own behavior caused the assault. This is something sexual abuse victims struggle with a lot. Did I do something to bring about this? The way I acted, the way I carried myself, what was it that caused this person to do this to me? And so this is a belief that my own behavior has somehow caused this. And so they begin to blame themselves. If only I'd have done this differently, if only I'd have done this differently. And they begin to take on this sense of guilt because maybe I somehow caused this. And this is a reality that sexual abuse victims struggle with. It's also a belief, secondly, that my own character, personality led to the assault. So therefore, I must have deserved this. I must have done something. I must just be a bad person. Therefore, bad things happen to me. Therefore, I deserve this. And so there's self-blame and this guilt. Or as one sexual abuse person put it, as they were being abused, their perpetrator, or the person abusing them, would say over and over, "You're a dirty girl, and dirty girls do dirty things." Therefore, they develop that identity that dirty people do dirty things. That's why I deserve this. So this idea of self-blame is really, really prevalent within victims of abuse. They begin to look at themselves as part of the problem rather than being the victim. And that's a dangerous place to be. Sexual abuse also brings a lot of anxiety and fear. During an assault, victims feel terrified, fearful, helpless, and humiliated. Read Tamar's account. And again, the terror, the fear, the begging, the pleading, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and he does it. So victims of abuse are more likely to develop life-dominating problems with anxiety and depression. Listen, if there's struggles with anxiety, depression, just this fear sometimes, a lot of times it can be traced back to a sexual abuse in the past that hasn't been dealt with, that's produced these feelings, panic attacks, anxiety, things that they can't control. And sometimes abuse victims can't even identify what it is or why it's happening. They just think that you know what it is? They realize I'm broken. And sometimes they can't even always identify why am I broken. But they were violated, they were sinned against, and then so they're living with the reality that they're just broken. And sometimes they're living in silence. And most of the time, because of the nature of sexual abuse, they live in silence. They live in this area where it's like nobody knows, but there is depression. And so we're good at giving people pills for depression. But what we have to do, particularly with sexual abuse victims, is not just give them a pill so they won't be depressed. We have to help walk them through healing. So is there hope? Is there hope for the sexually abused? Man, I wouldn't be up here talking today if there wasn't. Verse 21 says, when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister. You see, the story of Tamar really ends in disgrace. Her journey through sexual abuse leads her to living in her brother's house, desolate with her shame. But what I want to provide this morning is that there is hope. That that the story of sexual abuse doesn't have to end like Tamar's story ended. That the story of sexual abuse can have a different ending. It can have an ending where there is hope, where there is help, where there is deliverance from the anxiety, from the self-blame, from the fear, from the anger, from the bitterness, that there really is hope for the sexually abused. So whether you've been sexually abused or you know someone who has been, that we can provide hope and healing because there is hope. The first step that has to be taken is you have to admit what had happened to you and begin your journey to freedom. See, this is a journey that's going to start for some of you today. It's going to be a journey that you're going to walk with someone maybe starting today. See, denial or minimizing the sin against you will never lead you to healing and freedom. Never. Well, it was a long time ago. Well, maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe it wasn't even assault. I don't know. But you replay it over and over and over, and it haunts you and it plagues you So rather than admitting it, rather than getting help, rather than running to the arms of Christ where there is refuge and healing, what we do is we deny it or we minimize the impact of it, and as a result, we continue to be gripped by it. Notice, secondly, that the sin against you does not define you. For some people, the worst day of their life became the defining day of their life. That forever after the assault, what they walk around with is an identity that says, I am a sexual assault victim, and they wear that identity. I've been a victim, and what that produces is a whole host of issues and struggles and depression, because if my identity is assault victim, if my identity, I was raped, my identity is wrapped up in the sin against me, I am allowing that perpetrator to give me my identity, not God. And that's a huge struggle, that we understand that the identity is not who we are or what we've done. If we know Jesus, our identity is child of God. Our identity is loved. Our identity is secure. Our identity is one who has been declared righteous. So understanding that the sin against you does not define you is a huge step moving forward. But you also have to understand this, because in the moment of sexual abuse, you feel alone, abandoned, and as though God has forgotten about you. And can I tell you this morning that God does not ignore your hurt? He doesn't. But rather, He enters your pain and He bears your shame and disgrace. You know how I know this? How do you know, Doug? Because Jesus Himself knows exactly what it's like to be shamed, betrayed, naked, bleeding, and crying out to the Father as He hung on a cross, bearing your shame and bearing your guilt. You think Jesus knows what it's like to be shamed? You think Jesus knows what it's like to bear guilt? Jesus enters into our condition, and with love and with compassion and with an understanding of what it is you're going through, He says, I was there. I know what it's like to be shamed. I know what it's like to carry the guilt. In fact, all of the rapes, all of the sexual assaults that have ever been committed for those who know Christ, guess what? I bore on my body on the cross. I know what it's like. I was there to the point where I cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? One of the 7 utterances of the cross, where the Father in heaven and the Son on the cross, who's bearing the shame and the wrath of the Father. Jesus cries out, why have you forsaken me? Jesus enters into our condition and He says, I know your shame, and I died to remove it. And so His death was to remove your disgrace, to remove our shame. That we as a church cannot be silent anymore, but that we as a church can be a place where there's hope, where there's healing. That we as a church can be a place where we can take people to Jesus, where we can push them to the cross, where they can find deliverance from their shame. Sexual assault produces a great deal of shame and disgrace, but Jesus died to remove it. In His death, He bears your shame. And get this, as Tamar tore her robe, put on sackcloth and ashes, what Jesus does on the cross is He offers you a new robe of righteousness to replace your torn robe of disgrace. This is the message we preach. This is the message of the gospel. Whether a victim of sexual abuse or just a person struggling with sin, bearing the shame and disgrace of sin, Jesus offers you a robe of righteousness to cover your sin, to cover your shame, and to rid you of your disgrace. And last of all, for Tamar, the mourning, the crying, that was her final word. But for the believer who knows Jesus, resurrection. Resurrection, the hope of a future day in which Jesus will take all that has gone wrong in this world, and in a moment when He returns, He will come and He will judge the dead. He will judge the sinners. He will raise up to life the dead. He will bring in a new heaven. He will usher in a new earth. And at that point, we find in the book of Revelation, the Apostle John sees a vision of this day coming. It's not here yet. Right now we have pain. Right now we have sexual abuse. Right now we have all of these things that bring shame and disgrace. But there's a day coming. And this is what I want to push us all to look forward to, particularly the victims of sexual abuse. That there's a day coming, John says, when he heard a loud voice from the throne of heaven saying this, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. And he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God." Verse 4, Revelation chapter 21. What will he do? We weep right now. We mourn right now. But one day, there's a day coming when he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. This is the day we point people to. I know there's shame. I know there's crying. I know there's weeping. But one day, Jesus himself will wipe your tears. And death shall be no more. Neither shall there be any what? No mourning, nor crying, nor pain. It'll all be taken away. I know there's pain now. I know that. I get that. There's pain now. But one day there won't be. Why? Because the former things have passed away. So there's really just two points I want to make as we wrap things up this morning. First of all, for those of you who are not a victim of sexual abuse, but you know someone that has been a victim, you know someone that struggled with breaking from their past, are you prepared to enter their pain? This is a difficult thing to do, to enter the pain of an individual who's got the mourning. Are you ready to weep with those who weep? Are you ready to mourn with those who mourn? Sometimes this is hard for the church to do because we want to be clean and we want to be pretty and we want to come to church and pretend like everything's okay, don't we? Oh, if we could just take off those masks, if we could just kind of get rid of those pretenses that we're all okay, because we're not. You're not okay. If you've never dealt with your sexual abuse, you're not in freedom right now. And if you're stiff-arming the people around you that have pain because you don't want their pain to invade your happy life, this is not what the gospel calls us to. The gospel calls us to weep with those who weep, to mourn with those who mourn, to embrace the hurting, to not be as David, angry but do nothing, but yes, be angry, but allow that anger to drive you to righteousness. Allow that anger to drive you to help and to come alongside the hurting and to point them not to yourself, but to point them to Jesus who died to take away their disgrace. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to enter the pain of the abuse so that you can show them the healing power of the cross? And then today, if you've struggled with this, if you're someone that sat in silence, today could be your first step. Mike's going to come and lead us in a song. And I want to give you an opportunity at some point today. Listen, I'm here. Pastor Peralt's here. That if you need help, the church is here. That if you know that this is a struggle, that if you know that you need someone just to pray for you, that if you need to take a first step toward victory, toward the journey to healing and freedom, that can be a reality for you. It can be. Man, we've got people in this church that have walked that journey. We've got men and women who have been sexually abused that have walked that journey to freedom, and they'd love to help you. They'd love to help walk that journey with you. As elders, we would love to walk that journey with you. If you know someone that's been abused and you're unsure of how to walk that journey, man, come talk to us.